Good afternoon, everyone. We will get started in just a few moments. We just started the webinar. Let me allow all the attendees to get on board. Welcome, welcome. And we will get going here in just a few moments. So glad all of you could join us in this new year of 2022. This new technology is giving us a new challenge. We are adjusting around that because of the pandemic. It's not quite like walking in a room and everybody's just sitting there. We have to get in, and I'm watching as people continue to come in. And so I'm going to allow a few moments to give everyone a chance to join the webinar before we actually start. So we'll be maybe 2, maybe 3 minutes later than right now starting. So here's hoping all of you had a good holiday and your new year is off to a very prosperous start. That, like the rest of us, we're getting used to the new world of stabilized protocol handling of the pandemic. We're all learning how to adjust to a new normal. Okay, it is 5:03. We will start precisely at 5:05. That should give everyone a chance to get on. And there are people coming out of different time zones. Oh, someone said, can I read the quote behind me? That's a versatile background. That is the Ada B. Wells quote that says, the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. And for those of you that may have read my tribute to a very good friend, a very close supporter of LSP, I also quoted a lady by the name of Ella Baker who said, give light and people will find a way. And I think as we deal with the legacy of racial terrorism, there is a need to shine the light on the wrongs, and there's a need to also help people find a way forward. So I'm very excited about that. And I pay a great deal of attention to that. But the sign behind me, and I hope you're able to read that, that is reading right, Lynching Sites Project over my head. It's not backwards, right? Okay. Okay,
it's legible. It's legible.
Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It is 5:05. We are going to go ahead and start. This is the first time I've done this in quite some time. So let me say again to all of you that are here, a very hearty welcome. Glad you're joining us in the year of 2002. Our work is as important now as it has ever been at any time, and maybe even perhaps more important. But as we always do before we get started, it is a core value for those of you that may be new, and certainly those of you who've been with us before, that in the Lynching Sites Project, everything that we do, we always start with a moment of silence. That has been our mantra since we started way back in 2015. Even though I did not join the organization until 2017, it's just a value that we take a moment out of silence to reflect on what it is that we're about to do. And today, we have a very exciting presenter. We have Professor Guy Lancaster with us. And I'm going to make another statement about him and allow Norwood, who's a friend of his, to introduce him in just a moment. But he is going to talk about lynchings. And I'm going to ask all of us, as we take 3 minutes of silence, I want you to think about the current situation with the voting, with the challenge to secure the voting rights of everyone that has been so hard fought and won over many years, and what's taking place right now in our country. And the reason I'm tying that particular moment of silence into the idea of lynching, because so many people lost their lives, one, to secure the right to vote, and two, because they tried to exercise the right to vote. So I think it's appropriate in 2022, going into this meeting, that we take and we're going to take 3 minutes, and just simply, I want you to think about what that franchise of voting means, and think about the people who lost their lives trying to secure that franchise. I don't think we should lose sight of that. So with that, we'll start our 3 moments of silence. Okay, thank you, everyone. In just a moment, I'm going to ask Norwood if she would be so kind as to introduce Professor Lancaster, and I'm going to say something, and I'm sure Norwood will repeat it, and I'm sure Professor Guy will repeat it again. He is the author of a book that's just recently come out called American Atrocity: The Types of Violence in Lynching. But there's a quote that I ran across Professor Lancaster today. I was watching one of his presentations, and I want to share it with everyone. I shared it with a few people that I invited to join this webinar. And Dr. Lancaster said in one of his presentations in 2018, Lynching was not the odd and unpredictable outbreak of irrational violence, but a manifestation of our very best traditions of law and order. Not to punish those who committed lynchings was fundamentally a political decision made because mob violence committed with perfect impunity was in accord with a particular political vision. In other words, lynching was a political act, and our present society exists as it does, not in spite of the mob violence of past, but precisely because those traditions and that political worldview that we have inherited. And that was Dr. Lancaster. And with that, Norwood, I'm going to turn it over to you and take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. And thank you, John. And I appreciate the time to think about the voting rights. When the King family came out over the weekend and said no celebration without legislation, it was a great reminder of why we have Martin Luther King Day. So I appreciate the 3 minutes to think on that. Now, for our wonderful program today, I am very honored and humbled that Guy Lancaster has accepted the opportunity to come to talk to us today. I became familiar with Guy's work as the editor of the Encyclopedia of Arkansas a number of years ago at the Butler Center in Little Rock. Guy has, if I get this right, y'all, he's produced a number of books on racial violence in Arkansas. And much like the Lynching Site's website, the Encyclopedia of Arkansas has also listed and documented many events of racial terror and violence. And I encourage you to check out the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. We will have a PDF that will be sent out afterwards that relate to the links that are parallel to the narratives that Guy will be discussing today. And if you're interested in Guy's new book, I'm going to plug it for you. You can get it through the University of Arkansas Press. So everyone, please, a warm welcome to Guy Lancaster.
Thank you, Norwood. Thank you, John. Thank you, Jessica, for putting this up. And thank you, Lynching Sites Project, for all the phenomenal work all of you do. It's really been an inspiration, and I know a number of people doing similar work here in Arkansas have really been inspired by you. I do want to mention that most all of the events I'll be talking about today, you can find them on the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. And in fact, if you go to our main entry on lynching, and actually if you just Google lynching in Arkansas, you'll come up with the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. We have a chart that we're constantly updating that lists, to the best of our knowledge, all of the lynching events that occurred in Arkansas. And we have separate entries on, I believe, more than 200 of those events. We're developing new entries all the time. So it's a fairly dynamic project, and I hope you will check that out. So my talk today is a little bit different. It's about lynching as much as it is about those events that were reported as lynchings, but were not. So I'm just going to dive into it. I don't have any slides. I tend not to provide visual representations of lynching when I'm giving a talk. I think it's a questionable practice. I think that the images we have of lynchings are important evidence. I don't necessarily think they should be shared in an environment like this. I just want to focus on telling the stories, as it were. And I'm going to start with that. So in mid-December of 1889, there appeared in several national newspapers an account of a quadruple lynching that occurred in rural central Arkansas. One of these reports, under the headline, "4 Highwaymen Lynched," ran in the December 18, 1889 issue of the Indianapolis Journal, and the entire account reads as follows. It is reported that 4 robbers have been lynched in Maumelle Township by a vigilance committee. Saturday evening, Henry Wright, a well-to-do farmer, went to Fletcher's store at Big Maumelle, and while en route, 4 masked men stopped his team, drew their pistols, and demanded his money or his life. He assured them that he was unarmed and had no money. They refused to believe him, and he made a desperate fight with his fists, but was knocked out of the rear of the wagon, falling to the ground insensible. Sunday morning, Wright was found by neighbors who'd gone in search of him, and he, although fatally injured, rallied sufficiently to describe his assailants. A vigilance committee was at once organized, and the murderers were caught and lynched. So, although brief, this account has enough detail in it to warrant a belief that it must be based upon accurate sources. We have the name of the victim of these highwaymen, Henry Wright. We have mention of his status, that of a well-to-do farmer. The date he was attacked, Saturday would have been December 14. We have the details of his attack, namely what he was doing when assaulted, how many people carried out this assault, and how Wright managed to sustain his injuries. Moreover, the fact that he was able to communicate to neighbors suggests that the above information was conveyed to authorities and the media by eyewitnesses. Only with the last line does the account suddenly become vague, for it says nothing about the composition of this vigilance committee, how they went about locating these 4 highwaymen, whether there was any struggle to apprehend the men, whether the suspects claimed innocence or acknowledged their guilt, where and when these men were caught, and where, when, and by what means the men were lynched. Perhaps even odder still, the race of the apparent lynching victims goes unsaid, giving the impression that the 4 highwaymen were likely white, as most newspapers of the era would have happily extolled the violence and depravity of African Americans if they had had the opportunity. Despite the vagaries underlying this nationally circulated report, it does nonetheless appear to recount a lynching that actually took place. And as a consequence, these 4 unnamed men appear on many inventories of lynching victims. However, more local reports seem to contradict all of this. For example, an article from the December 16, 1889 Arkansas Democrat reads, "It was reported here this afternoon that an attempt had been made by 3 Negroes to rob a reputable citizen in Maumelle Township Saturday night, and that the men had been captured and hanged by the citizen." But the following day, the Democrat and its local brevities column contradicted this earlier report, writing, "It turns out that the 4 Maumelle robbers were not caught and hanged as reported. The county would have suffered no great loss had the report been true. As it is, however, they are at large." A subsequent blurb followed up on this information. Quote, "None of the men who assaulted Henry Wright in Maumelle Township a few days ago with the intention of robbing him have been caught." So which account do we trust with this? The national stories give a wealth of detail about Wright and his actions on the day he was assaulted. But while the Arkansas Democrat confirms some of these details, it also takes pains to update its readers about the story, including issuing a correction regarding the claim that a lynching had occurred. The local newspaper would seem to have a greater claim to the facts, yet there's something troubling about the brevity with which it treats its subject. One might, after all, imagine that a newspaper reporting on 3 or 4 violent highwaymen at loose in the county would provide its readers even with a general description of the men in question, especially if Henry Wright were still alive to convey this information. And what was local law enforcement doing to apprehend these men? We simply do not know. For the newspaper record of this event ends here, and so we cannot determine whether they met their deaths at the hands of a mob or not. So since the Equal Justice Initiative released its first report on lynching in America in 2015, and 3 years later opened the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which commemorates Black victims of lynching in the United States, there has followed a greater local interest in memorializing the individual victims of racialized violence. Here in Arkansas, the year 2021 witnessed 2 markers being installed to commemorate lynching victims, and more such markers are in the works. And not even the Arkansas General Assembly's distaste for so-called divisive concepts threatens to slow down the process of some kind of reckoning with our history of atrocity. Given the fraught nature of the events in question, one must be even more careful to get the history correct. We might wish to rely upon those lists assembled by our predecessors, organizations like the Tuskegee Institute and the NAACP, which did produce catalogs of lynchings at a time when those events were still taking place. But even these organizations misidentified certain events, occasionally conflating death at the hands of a mob with death at the hands of a court. Of course, sometimes the difference between a lynching and an execution is merely the sum of the formalities attached to the procedure of producing someone's death. For example, in 1881, Charles Jones was arrested in Fort Smith on charges of having attempted to rape a woman in Spadra. When he was returned to Spadra, quote, a band of 100 armed men awaited his arrival, according to the Arkansas Gazette, which added, just as the train was leaving, a man called to the conductor to wait about 20 minutes, and he would see a very dramatic piece of work. The newspaper went on to report, Jones was arraigned before an examining court. There was no trouble in selecting a jury. No one pleaded that he belonged to a fire company and was therefore relieved of jury duty. The trial was very short. The sentence of death was pronounced by the judge and vociferously echoed by the crowd. Jones was taken to a tree and hanged. He begged, but he did not, as is usual in such cases, protest his innocence. A loud cheer burst from the crowd when the body of the wretch dangled at the end of the rope. So what happened here had all the formalities of a trial while also exhibiting an atmosphere typical of lynchings, especially if it did occur within the 20 minutes the article said. Therefore, it is certainly understandable that this event should appear on many inventories of racialized violence. However, such is not the case with other events. Jim Davis, dubbed in newspaper accounts Crazy Jim, was reported in several national publications as lynched on December 9, 1896, a fact that was duplicated in the 1919 NAACP publication, 30 Years of Lynching in the United States, 1889 to 1918. However, Davis was not lynched, but was instead captured, put on trial, and executed on February 25th, 1897. A stranger case is the September 5, 1913 execution of Lee Sims in Little Rock. Despite the wide publicity given this first person to die in Arkansas's electric chair, Sims still somehow ended up being listed as a victim of lynching in the February 1914 issue of The Crisis, a listing that has only been repeated down the years in other sources, such as Ralph Ginsberg's 1962 book, 100 Years of Lynchings. Even aside from occasions where a person's death is listed as a lynching rather than an execution, there are cases aplenty where we run into the conundrum of attempting to determine whether or not to reckon a particular event as a lynching. For example, on March of 1898, the Kansas City Journal reported under the headline, Arkansas Negro Boy Lynched, the following. A Negro boy whose name cannot be learned was lynched at Marcella in Stone County Tuesday night. He was accused of stealing $20 from the cash drawer of his store. The mob strung him up 3 times in an effort to make him confess and finally left him on the ground in a dying condition. The Arkansas Gazette in this instance contains a much more detailed narrative that on a few small points contradicts the nationally circulating report, despite both being datelined Batesville, March 17. The Gazette, for one, has this action occurring on Saturday, March 12, rather than Tuesday, March 15. It does not specify the amount of money taken, only reporting, quote, some days ago, the cash drawer in the store of a merchant named Casey was robbed of a small amount of money. The Negro boy at the center of this drama remains unnamed, save that he was, quote, employed by Mr. Hess. The Kansas City Journal describes the affair as a lynching, a word connoting at this time a definite lethal quality, even though its narrative does not have the unnamed boy dead at the end, but only in a dying condition. However, the Arkansas Gazette, while going into greater detail about the tortures inflicted upon this unnamed boy, would seem to deny the title of lynching. According to it, on Saturday night, quote, a band of about 25 regulators took the boy into the woods and tried to force him to tell where the money was. Upon his denial of the theft, the mob put a halter around his neck and swung him up to a limb. Before being completely strangled, the mob let him down, but the boy, quote, refused to acknowledge his guilt, and the mob swung him up again. After the second round, he still refused to confess, and so was subjected to a third round of torture. And here the Gazette begins to relish in the details. Quote, with the boy's body dangling in the air, covered with blood which flowed in streams from wounds in his neck caused by the terrible jerking of the rope, the mob pointed their guns at the half-dead Negro, and the leader shouted to him that he would be given just 3 seconds to confess, and that if a sign were not forthcoming when he counted 3, every gun in the crowd would be discharged into his body. After the count of 2, the boy, quote, made the sign indicating that he was ready to confess and was thus let down, upon which he confessed in an incoherent manner, according to the report. This account ends thusly. The mob, satisfied with the Negro's guilt, decided that he had been punished enough and dispersed, leaving their victim to take care of himself. He will probably recover. There were, of course, no follow-up reports on the fate of this boy, whether he lived or died. And so there remains the question of whether an unambiguous murder, and thus an actual lynching, as scholars would categorize it, actually happened. In this case, there are no doubts about the fact that an actual mob perpetrated the deed. However, what about those cases where we know that someone was in fact killed, but the reported facts leave us to speculate about the nature of the perpetrators? On March 11, 1894, a group of African Americans were returning to Little Rock from a trip to nearby Marseille when they, quote, found the decayed body of a mulatto woman, probably about 30 years of age, suspended from the limb of a tree. She appeared to have been dead for several days, and around her neck was a placard bearing the words, "If anybody cuts this body down, they will share the same fate." The lack of information about this crime led the Gazette to conclude, the woman is supposed to have been lynched, but when, by whom, and for what reason, no one is able to state. On August 31 of 1897, the body of a Black man was found entangled in a trout line in the Arkansas River near the Jefferson County community of Rob Roy. The brief account notes only that the man had several gashes on his head and that there was a rope around his neck, factors that once again led the newspaper to speculate that the unidentified victim had been lynched. Whatever the definition of lynching one favors, the fact that lynchings are perpetrated by groups tends to remain central. But here we have 2 specific cases that contemporaries are willing to label as probable lynchings, cases that consequently have appeared on most registers of lynching events, without any firm determination as to whether or not these murders were perpetrated by a plurality of persons. So what conclusions should we draw from this uncertainty underlying many accounts of lynching, especially given that these uncertain accounts could have a cumulative effect and fundamentally shape how activists and scholars interpret the phenomenon of racial violence? Well, we know how white Southerners at the time made use of this uncertainty. On January 27, 1898, the Arkansas Gazette, charging that a gross wrong had been done to the state, published an article titled "The Chicago Tribune's Statement," which, quote, undertook to secure the facts from well-known parties for purposes of discrediting the Tribune's figures for lynching in Arkansas the previous year. The Tribune had totaled up 11 lynchings for the state, but of these 11, the Democrat cast particular aspersions on 7, alleging that either no such lynching took place or that the person in question was killed while resisting arrest, or in one case by an enemy. While the Democrat is clearly looking to defend the reputation of white Arkansas, the article describes one of these reported lynchings as occurring only in the same way such a thing would have happened in Chicago. But the author has a point when he states, quote, "It is no evidence that a lynching has occurred to show that a body has been found and that a death has resulted from foul means. Indeed, one of the cases challenged by the Democrat is the very discovery of a body on a trot line near Rob Roy. Another was the murder of James Murray, described in nationally circulating reports as a lynching, even though he was a white constable very likely killed by a white man whom he had just arrested. So while the editorialist is obviously attempting to free the state of Arkansas from the aspersions cast upon it by national outlets, he nonetheless is also making a legitimate claim about the uncertainty underlying any attempt to create a register of events from source material of varying quality. Of course, one has to keep in mind the fact that just as not all events reported widely in newspapers are actually lynchings, so not all lynchings were necessarily reported in newspapers. Recently, the historian Joshua Youngblood published an account of the apparent 1865 lynching of one Hugh Johnson in Pulaski County in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, an event that went unreported in the media of the era and is only known from court documents. But these court documents are official records, and so they carry the weight of authority. Some non-governmental sources also testify to similar occurrences of violence. One event that shows up on many national registers of lynching in the United States is the reported mass murder of 24 African Americans, men, women, and children, outside of Pine Bluff in March of 1866. This event, however, is attested to by only a single letter dated May 28, 1866, from one William L. Mallett to Thaddeus Stevens. There are no other sources confirming the historicity of this massacre, despite the hard work of various historians to turn something up, including a friend and colleague of mine, Rick Bucklew, who has just been doing some really hard work trying to dig something up. So the letter does purport to relay a personal experience. Moreover, it's easier to accord this letter the weight of authority when we understand the violence detailed in it accords with other acts of documented violence that occurred in the immediate post-war period. But what about evidence that does not appear in any source accessible to historians? We like to pretend that historians deal with reality, but this is actually untrue. Historians deal with facts, and facts, as the philosophers Kevin Mulligan and Fabrice Correa write, are, quote, the objects of certain mental states and acts. They make truth bearers true and correspond to truths. They are part of the furniture of the world. In other words, facts are grounded in evidence. If someone is killed in a remote corner of Arkansas or anywhere, that death is a physical reality. But if the murder does not come to light through any newspaper article, court records, letters, or oral histories provided by those immediately concerned or their descendants, and if the body is never uncovered to provide what forensic evidence it might silently offer, then this killing does not constitute a fact as we understand it, and it cannot fall within the purview of the historian. Of course, historians use sources in the attempt to arrive at as accurate a representation of reality as possible, but sometimes these sources fail to provide significant justification for one belief or another, as exemplified by some of those accounts I've already touched upon. So if the preceding analysis seems to argue exclusively that the inventories of lynchings compiled by historians and activists are too high, well, we also cannot dismiss the possibility that the numbers are too low. There does exist the possibility that killings we might define as lynchings have failed to manifest themselves in the source materials available to historians due to two types of epistemic injustice, as explicated by the philosopher Miranda Fricker. The first is what she calls testimonial injustice, and occurs, quote, when prejudice causes a hearer to give a deflated level or credibility to a speaker's word. Testimonial injustice in this context could mean that the report of a lynching given by an African-American testifier is dismissed out of hand or reinterpreted as some other phenomenon. A simple revenge killing, for example, an accident, a private matter, due to the race of the person providing the testimony. Such injustice may also act preemptively. As Fricker writes, the credibility of such a person on a given subject matter is already sufficiently in prejudicial deficit that their potential testimony is never solicited. So the speaker is silenced by the identity prejudice that undermines her credibility in advance. Such victims of testimonial injustice, writes Frichter, are wrongly excluded from participation in the practice that defines the core of the very concept of knowledge. They are, as far as we are concerned here, denied the ability to be historical sources of historical information at all. After all, the dominant white social world would mitigate any attempts to foster a contrary understanding, or even to preserve and disseminate the basic facts of racialized violence. Consequently, some knowledge of such violence has likely existed through time only within closed epistemic loops. As the philosopher Charles Mills has written, if Black testimony could be rejected because it was likely to be false, it could also be rejected because it was likely to be true. Testimony about white atrocities, lynchings, police killings, race riots would often have to be passed down through segregated informational channels, Black to Black, too explosive to be allowed exposure to white cognition. In contrast, what Miranda Fricker calls hermeneutical injustice, quote, occurs at a prior stage when a gap in collective interpretive resources put someone at an unfair disadvantage when it comes to making sense of their social experiences. That is, people subject to hermeneutical injustice can be excluded from knowledge about themselves and their own social situation, from our shared social understandings typically reflect the perspectives of different social groups, so that the powerful tend to have appropriate understandings of their experiences ready to draw on as they make sense of their social experiences, whereas the powerless are more likely to find themselves having some social experiences through a glass darkly, with at best ill-fitting meanings to draw on in the effort to render them intelligible. This means that for the person in question, there exist blanks where there should be a name for an experience, which it is in the interest of the subject to be able to render communicatively intelligible. These lacunae thus create a sense of dissonance between an experience and the various constructions that are ganging up to overpower its nascent proper meaning. And one of the examples Fricker uses is the concept of sexual harassment, which as a concept didn't really emerge until the mid-20th century as women entered the workforce in greater numbers and began to share their experiences of that with each other. Many individual women who attempted to make sense of being harassed didn't have the necessary tools to draw upon. They were often gaslit and told, you're overreacting, this is just how that person is. And it wasn't until women shared their own experiences of that they were able to make sense and give a name to this phenomenon. And so we might imagine in the context of lynching and in the context of racial injustice, a Black person who has been denied the tools necessary to make proper sense of the larger social environment, and thus could well end up accepting the dominant white perspective of inherent Black criminality against his or her own lived experience, which may well affect how that person interprets a violent murder, whether it's regarded as an unjust lynching or a just use of force. It is the nature of oppression to create an environment in which the totality of its record cannot be ascertained. While the Arkansas Democrat sought to discount 7 of the 11 murders the Chicago Tribune had listed as lynchings, there could well have been perpetrated any number of vigilante murders that never showed up on any published list in the first place. Murders the commission of which would have been known only to a handful, with the memory of them eventually being lost to time. So research into lynching, just as research into any other historical phenomenon, can thus breed a certain amount of doubt. And this is entirely proper and in some respects even advantageous. The philosopher Marcus Gabriel writes, knowledge acquisition and doubt are not merely compatible, they are not even independent phenomena. We need only to consider the all too familiar fact that with every increase in knowledge, we also acquire knowledge of what we do not yet know of our own ignorance. This knowledge can give rise to skepticism, which Gabriel defines as, quote, a feature of theory construction that arises at a point in the transition from a natural attitude toward reality to an explicit grasp of the structure of that attitude. The structure of that natural attitude toward reality is created in part by the assumption that the terminology we employ applies to specific entities or activities. However, the terms we use more often constitute a kind of discourse, with our social conventions shaping the categories into which we place things. This holds true for something like lynching. Lynching is a term which, according to the scholar Ashraf Rushdie, is phenomenally problematic for three reasons. First, he writes, it is more evocative than descriptive, connoting quite different historical acts among the population depending upon time and place. Second, this same term has been used to designate acts that demonstrate a wide range of diverse motives, strategies, technologies, and meanings, ranging from acts of rough justice in frontier societies lacking the apparatus of state judiciaries to acts of direct defiance of those state judiciaries in more established societies. Finally, lynching, he writes, is a politically encumbered term that can entail ideas of popular sovereignty, like the classic Wild West lynching, or Southern honor, being the more racialized lynchings. Likewise, for the historian Christopher Waldrep, there is no singular behavior that can be called lynching. Any attempt to impose a definition on such a diverse, subtle, and complex reality will inevitably miss the point. This complex reality is not reflected in the registers of lynchings assembled by the likes of the Equal Justice Initiative or its predecessors, wherein discrete numbers are applied to specific counties and on to specific states, giving the sense that instances of lethal racialized violence might be duly enumerated given enough historical research. These numbers belie the vagaries attendant upon determining whether a particular event constituted a lynching or not. They also belie the fact that their creation depends not upon the reality of murders, but upon sources. They are thus simultaneously somewhat too high, given the dubious nature of some recorded deaths as we've seen, and far too low, given the likelihood that many lynchings went unrecorded, to capture the reality of people's lived experience in the past. Lynching constitutes not a discrete phenomenon, but instead a discourse, a concept that is varied over time and place. Likewise, with the numbers that lend an air of quantifiable facticity to the work undertaken by historians, sociologists, and activists. After all, the numbers employed by historians are the result of certain choices made beforehand, choices in the region being studied, the American South versus the American West, for example, the time period in question, with most studies of lynching, at least in the South, focusing upon the post-Reconstruction era and on up to the mid-20th century, or the racial classifications of lynching victims. These are all choices that determine beforehand what events will end up counting as a lynching, and likewise determine the significance attached to those events, be they regarded as deviations from the best traditions of law and order, or instead as manifestations of state violence against certain groups. What we decide to include within the category of lynching will also shape the moral frameworks we seek to instantiate in society at large and to pass on to forthcoming generations. And Josh, are you? I thought I heard something, but never mind. I've got one more paragraph or so. So scholars who research racialized violence often act as if they could somehow more capably quantify the terror experienced by the African American population at large, or depending upon the area under study, the Latino population, the Asian population, etc., by means of determining a more exact number of the lynchings that occurred in the United States. But just as many Americans learned to fear foreign terrorists by watching the collapse of the Twin Towers live on television and through the subsequent days and weeks of news reporting, as well as the spread of rumor and innuendo about possible future terror attacks, so too did the full psychological impact of lynching exist and persist beyond the individual casualty. As the historian Brent Campney has argued, we need to go beyond the enumerated body count and explore lynchings in the making, those threatened and prevented lynchings, which, as he writes, generated a level of fear among Blacks commensurate with that experience during completed lynchings, because the final outcomes could never be predicted. And we need better studies of how stories of lynchings circulated through various communities who knew themselves targeted for violence, how news or even rumor and unconfirmed or contested reports might shape these communities and their collective sense of self. After all, laying aside the dubious nature of the events mentioned above, there exists copious confirmed incidents of lynching, however one might want to define it, so as to have lent, for the people alive at the time, a certain credence even to uncertain accounts. This experience of fear and terror is simply not quantifiable. And so if we wish to draw lessons for current practice from our interpretations of the past, then we need to go beyond the numbers and place the experience front and center, the experience of those who lived, not just those who died. And with that, I will happily take some questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Guy. Excellent presentation. I certainly have a lot of questions, but I want to give the audience a chance. All of you out there, if you look down on your screen somewhere, you should have a Q&A. And if you'll click that and type your questions in, we will try and get an answer for you. So while I'll give the audience a chance to enter that question. Guy, let me, you mentioned lynchings and near lynchings, and I'd just like to put a little bit of comment or a plug in. We had a young lady with another organization I'm involved with, Tennesseans for Historical Justice. She did the work and created an interactive map of lynchings and near lynchings in Tennessee. I mean, you can actually click on it and you can see it by race, sex. I don't know if you've seen that or not.
I have seen it. It's an amazing map. Yes,
it is. I mean, she really put a lot of work into that. And something else while I'm waiting on, and please, anyone out there, just type your questions in or raise your hand. I think there's a marker there to do that. We talked about the credibility of the person who was giving the testimony about a lynching. And I'm thinking about two cases that I know about here in Haywood County, Tennessee. Neither one of them was recorded, but I got the story firsthand. One from a lady who's, when she was a young girl, her father was paid to take a man down that they had lynched and bury him. Mm-hmm. And the other is from a young lady who was 9 years old when she witnessed her father being lynched. And I say that as people talk about whether or not these things really occurred and how you credit them. I'm not a historian, but I think that just occurs to me that plays into it. Right. And one other, and yeah, go ahead. Any comments you'd like to make on that?
Well, no, I was going to say, you know, at the time Emmett Till was murdered, you know, many of the people who came down to cover the later trial and whatnot, you know, later said they heard from a lot of people that his wasn't the first body thrown into the Tallahatchie River, you know, not even the first body thrown in that decade. That, you know, there had been stories that sort of thing had happened regularly, and it's certainly believable that is true.
Yes, definitely.
If I may ask,
go ahead.
Guy, just thinking from a historian's perspective and how the narratives are preserved and who's doing the preservation and, you know, their motivation and their intent. When you're where you are now and you've researched the past and looking forward, one of the things that struck me while you were speaking other than quotes like alternative facts and accepting certain things as normal, was the quality of video and social media, especially when I think of George Floyd's murder, and how that affects the documentation and the categorization of what you're preserving, and how you preserve the narratives.
And see, you know, I think a lot of people know lynching through photographs. You know, there was the you know, very famous exhibition of lynching photographs that traveled the country. But you know, we also need to understand most of these events were not photographs. So the stories we have of them, you know, were kind of corrupted through newspaper accounts, or, you know, later second, third hand accounts. And we have some photographs of lynchings that we don't know where they occurred. There's one in the Butler Center collections that it is definitely a lynching, but we can't link it to anything. So we don't know where it was. So, you know, even those that were, you know, physically documented,
You have an empty narrative.
Right. We don't have the narrative to them. So more often we have the narrative and a lack of physical documentation, but this was the flip of that. You know, so we encounter a number of obstacles, you know, in trying to do this. And
I want to jump a little quick. Forest Laws has a question. You might be familiar with Forest. He writes with Fenton Press, a lot of agriculture. Sorry for the rest of you. Forest allows. There have been reports that white police officers carried a spare gun that they could throw down when they shot a Black person in Memphis in the 1920s and 30s. Could these occurrences be referred to or called lynchings?
I have heard this too, and I've actually heard the name drop gun. Heard that from a former policeman who worked in rural Arkansas, that, you know, it wasn't just African Americans, but if you shot anyone and it turned out they were unarmed, you could, you know, drop a gun there and claim that they had pulled that. So yeah, could these be termed lynchings? I think because the term lynching is kind of so variable, I would almost say you could say lynchings after the fact. And what I mean by that is, if you consider a case like Trayvon Martin, for example, killed in Florida, you know, he was killed by one person who was, unlike the mob, you know, identified and briefly taken into custody. You know, there wasn't great public acclamation for him at the start. It wasn't until they charged him. You know, he wasn't initially charged, so he had that impunity due to the stand your ground law. And then when he was charged, there became a great deal of public acclamation for him and public defense of him. So it's almost like, you know, the mob showed up after the murder, as it were.
Could we kind of would it be fair to interpret it as though, because thinking of it as a cultural pattern and thinking of the precedent where you would describe there being a mob as part of a definition, that the individual, especially when you have supportive legislation that says stand your ground, is reinforcing individual ownership of a mob mentality with the freedom to act on that.
Right. And the individual, due to that law, is essentially taking on the role of the state. He's acting, you know, on behalf of the state. And so, yeah, I think there's you know, lynching is a fuzzy category, but, you know, these murders do certainly bear a family resemblance, and especially given the involvement of police officers in lynching. You know, there was one in Little Rock in 1892, a man named Henry James was arrested, and there was fear that there was going to be a lynching. Well, the mayor had Henry James transferred from the city lockup to the county lockup because he didn't want to deal with it. You know, he didn't want his city jail broken into, you know, when the mob eventually came. Well, the county lockup sent him to the state pen. When the mob finally showed up at the state penitentiary, the warden there at the time greeted the mob and said, "Look, he's here. Don't come in now. We'll be transferring him back to the county jail in the morning, and you can get him then." So that's the policeman isn't doing the killing, but he's letting Henry James die. He's playing a role.
Unfortunately, there are some bad eggs in the history, the development of what is the police state.
Right.
There's another comment here. Rahab Mitchell, I hope I pronounced your name properly. Categories of tortures, i.e. skinning, burning, tar and feathering, dismembering, taking place prior to stringing a rope around the body or neck and hanging them from a tree, light pole or clothesline. Is a lynching defined by a rope only? In lynching at the curb, the victim was shot several times. Would you then recategorize this as not being a true lynching?
Yeah, John, before you answer that, I'd like to just offer a quick observation. One of the things I said, and I'd love to hear you respond in answering this question. One of the things that I said is that I think a lot of our discussion in trying to relate the legacy of lynching to today has to do with the fact that lynching in its purest sense is the taking of a life by 3 or more people by whatever means. But I think we miss when we do not add in that a lot of these lynchings had to do with the mutilization, with the brutalization of the body before death, and then the mutilization of the body after death was intended to send a message. It wasn't just the taking of a life, it was a form of control. And I think that maybe some of what Rab Mitchell is getting to here, but as I look at a lot of the lynchings that occurred, I've often said in presentations that I've done that we really need another word for these brutalizations of the human body, because it wasn't just taking a life, it wasn't punishment. Please go ahead, I just want to put that in.
Yeah, no, and that's certainly true. I mean, that goes beyond punishment. That's, you know, torture, cruelty. I was thinking, no, lynching isn't just the use of a rope to commit a murder. It's often associated with the rope. You know, and any number of books have rope in their title, like Carlos Hill's Beyond the Rope, and you know, we associate like the song Strange Fruit, images of people hanging. But no, lynching could be a person stabbed to death, beaten to death, shot to death. In 1892, in Texarkana, Arkansas, one man, Ed Coy, was literally chained to a stake and set on fire. And that is also a lynching. He was not hanged. And that's another case where he was, the souvenirs that went into circulation afterwards. A few weeks after Ed Coy's murder, there was just a brief line in the Arkansas Gazette that says, the cedar stump to which Ed Coy was burned has been manufactured into cuff buttons. So some local wood carver was taking this stump and carving, you know, cufflinks, you know,
Right.
to be worn by the respectable men of Texarkana, Arkansas.
Right. Mary Olson, I'm sure you know her as,
Yes.
Guy, what does this research lead you to want to do today so history does not repeat itself?
Scream sometimes. That's not very helpful, but that's sometimes. I mean, so history doesn't repeat itself. I guess researching this history makes me want to in part research and broadcast this history even more, especially as we see attacks on historical consciousness, you know, especially these anti-divisive concepts laws that have proliferated, you know, here in Arkansas and throughout the United States. You know, we do have to connect this to the present.
Yes.
It's no accident right now that it's been infuriating to see so many people respond to gerrymandering and these essentially anti-voting laws by saying, well, look, the voter turnout, you know, was very high in 2020, and you know, folks, you know, a different president was elected, so you have nothing to worry about. Well, no, these voter laws are a response to that high turnout. They are an attempt to dampen that turnout. It's not that, oh, we have nothing to worry about because we can always count on turnout. These voter laws are anti-turnout laws, essentially. They are attempting to make it harder to vote precisely because, you know, the African-American community, the Native community in Arizona, New Mexico, because these communities were successful in mobilizing. So we have to connect that to the past in order to understand it a whole lot better. You know, the past laws, Jim Crow laws, how it's often presented in like high school history is that people pass these laws, white folks pass these laws because they were racist. They didn't pass these laws because they were racist. They passed these laws because African Americans were successful at political mobilization.
Right.
You know, it was, don't look for an individual psychological you know, motive for this. The motive is political, the motive is economic. So yeah, what this research makes me want to do is work harder to connecting it to our present moment, because we need that connection. We need to understand it.
We really do. From Sammy McDaniel, I'm trying not to overthink this. Terror and trauma was a catalyst and the goal I judge. Yeah, any comment on that before I read the next question?
No, I think you're right.
From Elizabeth Walker, from David Marsh in Greenwood, Mississippi, a Black man was found hanging from a tree in a white middle-class neighborhood 5 to 10 years ago. The coroner ruled it suicide. The man was 12 feet off the ground and no ladder was found. Is this a lynching?
I've read about a number of cases, I think in Mississippi, that have recently been ruled suicides. And it's the sort of event that's a lot like what I was talking about, where just a body was found and it's, we don't know anything about the motive behind it. But if we're going to call what happened, you know, near Marche, the woman who was found dead for whatever reason, a lynching, we can certainly call these lynchings. You know, there's so many factors into this, and one of them is the fact that like my state, I don't know about Mississippi, my state, you don't have to be a medical professional to be elected coroner. You know, coroner's an elected position. We don't have medical professionals in these. So, you know, that's something that doesn't just affect how we interpret, you know, this sort of racialized violence, but, you know, relates and opens itself up to a whole lot of abuses. You know, the fact that we have these people elected at large, you know, rather than we have like a county medical examiner who's a professional. But yes, I think, you know, what we see happening certainly fits the bill.
Absolutely. I like what you said. We have to make the connection to voter suppression today and how and where it is rooted. It's rooted in the same evil that did those kinds of things then. It's wanting to suppress, which is what they wanted to do then. It's the same thing. You know, it's interesting that you talked about what was historically accurate And I think had there been no cell phone camera, there would have been no Ahmaud Arbery conviction. There would have been no George Floyd conviction had there been no cell phone camera.
Mhm.
Okay. Questions? Like I said, anyone just feel free to use the raise your hand or type a question in the Q&A. Guy, I am so appreciative of the work you're doing and the research you're doing and the writing that you're doing. Please continue. I'm looking forward to reading your book, American Atrocity, The Types of Violence and Lynching. I've long contended that, as I said, what the definition of lynching is. I also feel that way about a couple other words that we throw around. Enslavement. The enslavement that was done here was not like the enslavement that's referenced in the Bible. It's a very, very big difference.
Well,
slavery has been throughout the world. Yes.
And
no,
also,
go ahead, I'm sorry.
Slavery isn't just the formal institution that ended in 1865. That we had cases of peonage and debt slavery, continue on up through the middle of the 20th century.
Right.
So, but yeah, one of the things I do in American Atrocity, which I should plug, is if you order it from the UA Press website, it's 25% off right now. But one of the things I work to do in that book is to connect lynching to structural violence. So show how lynching isn't just an attack on a person, it's an attack on a whole community's economy and political well-being. So.
Yes, it is. Okay, let's see, we have another question. Profound presentation, thank you so much. Can't wait to read your book, from Rahab Mitchell. Okay, very good. I'm certainly looking forward to the book, and I know you've done this presentation for us, but I'd like to talk to you again about coming back doing a book tour with us and come back and talk specifically about the book. I'd like to get you to do that for the Tennesseans for Historical Justice as well. We'd love to have you, because I think the big challenge today for all of us doing this work is that we approach the history, but we have to make the connection to how it is tied to the reality that is today. Because I think this country's future, if is tied to what's happening with the vote, and if we don't protect that, democracy is in trouble, not just African Americans. Are there any other questions or comments out there?
Well, while you were speaking, John, I did flash to January 6th and the platform that was established for Vice President Pence. And how that mentality and the words mob mentality have transcended, and it has become a culturally accepted, and I do have issue when we've come to accept something that is really unacceptable. What's going on?
Yes, go ahead. No, I agree. I mean, the mere fact that they put up a gallows in front of the Capitol tells you exactly what is going on in this country. And as I said, certainly being African American, I worry about African Americans, but I worry probably even more for the democracy itself, because I think it's in dangerous peril.
Well, such brutality to bully, which is, I read somewhere a critique that there was more high-fiving of being a bully and successfully threatening and intimidating than there was about taking action to unify and make progress forward. And that quality of having reverence with your power to intimidate versus reverence for, let's come together, we're on this planet, what can we do to make it better for our kids, for grandkids? It's a huge, and what Guy you're unpacking is really admirable. Thank you for sharing today.
And it's, I think too, the intimidation, it's not just a demonstration of power, it's political in the sense that many of those Republicans who opposed the mob are now, retiring from Congress because they're getting constant death threats, and they're also aware that the base has shifted to embracing violence to the point where they can no longer get elected as Republicans.
Congressman Cohen made a comment today in one of his tweets that the people who had voted for John Lewis's voting rights, the Republicans who had voted before, this time voted against.
Mhm.
And I thought that was a very interesting shift that
Right.
he cited,
Mhm.
because that's about something else that's going on.
So, I mean, even the threat of violence is currently impacting the choices that some of our most powerful people in the country, are making. So how much more did it impact the choices of poor sharecroppers in the, Arkansas Delta, people who had no power whatsoever?
Was it the Southern Tenant Farmers entry in the Encyclopedia of Arkansas, I believe an article around Jericho,
Mhm.
that was a common tool.
Right. And, with that, you can also think how brave were those people who stood up at a lane, attempting to form a farmers union. And so, there's a comment a German writer made that, in war, every bullet that, hits your comrade also carries a message for you, namely that you may be next. And so that's every lynching, that's every person who, wasn't even found hanging from a tree, but just disappeared one day, never to be heard from again. And don't talk about it because you might disappear too.
It's very chilling.
The one thing that gives me a little bit of optimism doing the work that I'm doing is I want to believe that there are more people out there who really want the right thing. And I have to hope that there are more of them and that they will exercise the secrecy of the ballot box to make that known. Certainly, I understand people being afraid to take a public stand. And like you said, we have a lot of very powerful figures who obviously the spotlight is on them and they're afraid to really speak their heart. But I'm going to have to hope that there are a lot of good, solid Americans who, while they may not vocally say what they need to say, will go in and take advantage of the secret ballot and exercise the will that we hope will all come out. Now, we may have to fight about what that result is, but at least democracy has a fighting chance if that occurs. But if they do not go in, then yeah.
Midterms are vital, y'all. Midterms are vital.
Absolutely. Well, listen, if there are no further questions, going once, going twice, going 3 times, Guy, really appreciate your presentation, and I will absolutely be in touch. I would love to have you do a book and talk specifically about your book, and I will get in touch with you on that. Norwood, thank you very much for putting us in touch with him.
My pleasure. Happy to be of service.
We will post on our website and on our Facebook page. We will continue to post information pertinent to this there. He has given a very good list. He and Norwood have given a very good list of references and links you can go to further explore what he talked about today, and we'll post those there. My sincere thanks to everyone for being with us. Guy, thank you very much. Norwood, thank you very much for assisting.
Thank you for having me. This has been great.
Okay.